lamp to my feet and a light unto my path.
Amen. All right, you be seated. All right, good morning.
Good morning.
All right, turn that off mute. Make sure you can hear me. Hey, so y'all have asked really great questions as we've gone through this, and there is a question today that won't work. So when is a teaching? We're gonna have to get this worked out because I'm gonna really need this. Yeah. When is a teaching cultural? Now, what we mean by that is like if you're reading through the Bible and you get to a particular passage, and how do you know if that is a teaching for all time? And how do you know if that is a teaching for a specific culture? Now, a couple of words of warning before we jump into this. Number one is when we go beyond asking just historical questions about the text, and we start trying to decide if a teaching is cultural or if it is, let's use the word eternal, okay? Or if it's eternal, we're doing something that which the writers, they didn't include that in their notes. Okay, it's not like they would write in italics or a different language, or they would circle something if it was, it's like if Paul had like an asterisk that he used, so every time he got to something that he thought was cultural, he'd put an asterisk. That'd be really nice, wouldn't it? That would solve a whole lot of questions. But they didn't write that way. And so when we sit down and we start trying to interpret text and we start asking questions like this, we're asking a question for which there is no biblical instruction of how to answer it. Does that make sense? So it makes it pretty difficult. So I need to set some guidelines about what I think before we can jump into the question. So these are things that I think, and if you don't think these, this okay, but you don't have to stand up and tell me. All right. Number one, I believe the Bible is God's inspired word for the world, and it's applicable to every earthly time period and every culture. I think what we have in the text is exactly what God wants us to have. In fact, one of the questions when and I've told you this before, but one of the questions I ask when I open a text and I start to read it, of all the things that God could have written, why did he write this? Right? God could have written anything that he wanted to write. I mean, he wasn't limited. So he could have told you anything that he wanted to tell you. So why did he tell me the things that he told me in the text? Why did he say this as opposed to something else? Why did he write this on paper? So when I start to look at the text, I think the Bible is applicable to every culture. I think God wrote it that way. And I think because he wrote it that way, there are lessons that we can learn for every culture. Now, that being said, every biblical teaching contains a cultural element because it was written in a cultural setting. Are you with me with that? So when you read something in the text, there's a cultural element to it because it's in a cultural setting. Now, this is a really simple explanation and a really simple example. We just partook of communion, and we used bread and wine. Bread and wine. I think maybe one of the reasons that Jesus used bread and wine is because those were things that were common in his culture. I think there's a cultural element to that. Now, does that mean we can substitute something other than bread and wine? No, I wouldn't want to, but I think there's a reason that he chose those two things. I think they were common in his culture. And anytime you grab the text and you start reading something, for example, if you read the book of 1 Corinthians, it was written to a culture, right? It was written to a group of Christians who were living in Corinth. And you have to keep that in mind as you go through. So everything, if it's going to have a cultural setting. Here's my third thing. God and culture rarely align. God and culture rarely align. It's not often that culture gets God correctly. Now, I need to explain that a little bit. That seems a little confusing. In the very beginning, in the garden, you can eat of any tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Which tree did they eat out of? The tree God told them not to eat out of, right? Well, since that time, there's this dynamic going in the world where God and culture doesn't always align. Just because culture says something is okay doesn't mean God thinks it's okay. And many times the thing that God says is okay, or the thing that we should do, it's the thing that culture doesn't want to do. And this is a really simple example too, but like in the Old Testament, you were taught to take care of the widows and the orphans. In the Minor Prophets, one of the chief complaints that God had about his people is they were taking advantage of the widows and the orphans. So there was a culture that God said, this is what you're supposed to do, and even his own people, not talking about the whole culture, just his people were not doing the thing that he told them to do. And it's pretty common that God and culture really don't go together. So culture is not always a good guide of what God wants us to do. Now, the third thing is application of the biblical text to any, sorry, I went too far, to any culture is a pretty serious endeavor. There's a degree of seriousness that is attached to what I do. And I take that incredibly seriously. To look at the text, to study the text, to be a student of the text, a student of God's Word, and then look into a culture that's 2,000 years later and say, here are the principles that God has given you and how we should live by those principles. That's a really serious thing to do. And sometimes it's very difficult. And I'm not going to tell you it's always easy, because it's not. Now, if you grew up in the Church of Christ, and not all of you did, but some of you did, you've probably heard these words before: direct command, apostolic example, and necessary inference. Anybody ever heard those words before? All right, so some of y'all heard those words. When we start talking about those things, this is how I feel. I feel exactly like that, because I feel like I'm on such a slippery slope that I have no idea what I'm doing. And there are good principles in there, and like that little guy that keeps falling over and over again, that is just me, because I try to weigh through those. And you look at that and you say, well, what you're really trying to do when you were talking about culture and what is cultural and what's eternal, I think we're looking to identify timeless principles in teaching. What part of the text has this timeless principle in teaching? Now, I said direct command. It'd be really cool if we just said, I tell you what we'll do. As believers in Jesus, we just want to do the things that God told us to do. We could probably agree on that, couldn't we? If we just said, as believers in Jesus, we want to do whatever God told us to do. I think most of us would agree on that. So a direct command is a direct command. I mean, so let's just look at the direct commands and say, okay, let's just do the direct commands, right? We'll just follow every one of those. Like, you know, in your house, it might be clean up your room. It's not or wash the dishes. A direct command is a direct command, right? So let's just take Jesus. We'll use Jesus' direct commands. Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you have treasure in heaven, then come follow me. That's direct command. Let's just do that one. And we say, well, now, wait a minute, Craig. Hang on. That was that rich young man. He was a rich young ruler. And Jesus knew his heart. And he didn't tell everybody to sell their stuff and give it to the poor. But there's a principle there, right? What's the principle? Everything you have belongs to God. But we look at that and say, well, yeah, that's kind of direct command, but let's hang on to that one for a second. How about this one? I went to see Miss Nancy Blanton this week. Love her to death. Go to see Nancy Blanton, you know what she tells me? Romans 16:16. Greet one another with a holy kiss. I'll be honest. I hardly ever leave Miss Nancy that I don't kiss her on the cheek. Almost every time I go see her. Give her a little peck on the cheek. Then she'll smile and say, Romans 16:16. Yes, ma'am. Is that okay? Oh, yeah. Is that a direct command? You know, not only is that a direct command, Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, 1 Thessalonians 5:26, 1 Peter 5:14, greet one another with a kiss of love instead of a holy kiss, but same principle. Wow, you don't have very many commands in the Bible that occur as many as greet one another with a holy kiss. How many of y'all would be uncomfortable if you came in the back door this morning and I just gave y'all a holy kiss, male and female? I got a feeling y'all wouldn't line up next week. Hot babe, you'd be all right with that, wouldn't you? There we go. Direct command? Oh, yeah. It might be a little bit cultural. Well, the way we do it would be a little cultural maybe. Because in America, that's not what we do. You went to another place in the world at this same time, it would be very much the way that you would do it. And if you went there, you would have expected to do that. So yeah, there's a cultural element to it. Is there a principle in there? Oh yeah, it's a principle. Now we might do it in America well, we used to shake hands pre-COVID. Post-COVID, we fist bump, right? Or now we elbow bump. How many of y'all elbow bump? You elbow bump, you fist bump. Not many people are back to shaking hands yet. We just take direct commands. How about this one? Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. Direct command? Yeah, direct command. Now, let's be honest. Did I take it out of context? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I took it out of context. I took it out of context because the contextual part is just the next part of that, right? Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Therefore, are you married? Don't seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Don't look for a wife. Why? Because of the present crisis. You remain as you are. So when you read that text, you can't take it totally out of culture. Remember what I tell you, context, context, context. How about if we just use this one? Stop drinking water and use a little wine. Direct command? Oh yeah, direct command. So stop drinking water. Use a little wine. Taken out of context a little bit? Yeah, because I didn't really put down what he said. Stop drinking water and use a little wine because of your stomach and frequent illness. Okay. All I'm saying is sometimes with direct command, you say, we're just going to do what Jesus does. And sometimes even with direct command, we feel like that little guy who's fallen on the ice, right? It's okay, which direct commands do we take and which ones do we not? And it's a matter of principle. Now, I do think this. We shouldn't conclude that a divinely given instruction is culturally conditioned unless there's a sufficient textual evidence. Okay? And even when you look back at those, there were textual evidence of why it was a direct command for a particular situation or a particular reason. And there are some commands that are time-specific. Here's one from Jesus. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any of the towns of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Are you glad that one was time-sensitive? I'm extremely excited that one was time-sensitive because if we're only going to the sheep of Israel and we're not going to the towns of the Samaritans or among the Gentiles, Greg's not hearing the message about Jesus. Now, Jesus did that. He changed that himself, though, right? Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. There's an ordained way in the text that the text shows that one was time-specific for Jesus' ministry while he was on earth. And then after his death, he gave them other instructions. So even when you look at direct commands, you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we really figure out where those fit? Now, we've got this other thing, and we thought, well, we do about apostolic example. Now, this is the Cliff Note version, okay? Way back at the very beginning in the Restoration movement, when you had really great men of God who decided that they started a restoration of which we're a part. And the idea was very simply, what we need to do is everybody needs to go back to just doing what the Bible does, and then we can all worship together, and we won't have any kind of denominations, we won't have any kind of divisions, we'll just all do what the Bible says, and we'll all worship together. And by the way, I am an immense fan of the Restoration movement. And one of the questions became, well, how do we decide what they did? And it's a very honest question, and it's a very difficult question sometimes, and we still have the same question. So I thought we'd just look at one of their examples. So if you look at Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 7, if you want to follow along. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. And Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. And many lamps were in the upstairs room where we were meeting. And seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus. He was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. I hope y'all not doing that this morning. And when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. And Paul went down and threw himself on the young man and put his arms around him. Do not be alarmed, he said. He's alive. It's like, okay. And so he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. And after talking until daylight, he left. And the people took the young man home alive, and they were greatly comforted. Now, we read that and we say, okay, on the first day of the week they met together to break bread, which is what we just did a few minutes ago with the Lord's Supper. So when you look at that, you start asking which parts of that are important. Well, they met on the first day of the week. We think that was really important. They met on the first day of the week to break bread. Now, there's a couple of, you can't say more than the text says. Did they meet every first day of the week? They met every first day of the week. Did they meet every first day of the week to break bread? According to that verse. Well, they met that one. Got other verses where it said they met and broke bread, right? But not this one. This one just says they met on the first day of the week. That first day of the week, they met together to break bread. They met at night. They met with many lamps in an upstairs room, and they met until daylight. Which one of those are important? Which one are important? We met the first day of the week. We broke bread, right? Anybody see any candles? Technically, we are in an upstairs room, aren't we? Okay, so that's good. We got the upstairs room part right. How about meet until daylight? Preach on, brother. Yeah. When did they start meeting, by the way? When did they start meeting? Sundown. And Paul's going to go the next day, so he preaches till midnight. And then he raises a young man that falls out of the window, and they go back up and they break bread, they take communion, and then he speaks till daylight. Anybody want to sign up for that? We're going to start meeting on, well, we probably wouldn't sign up for that. Certain parts of that important? Are some of them cultural? Why do you think there were many lamps? Had to see. Yeah, didn't have electricity, right? How are you going to light the room? Have many lamps. And so you start looking at things like that, like 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 4. Now, this is really interesting. And this is an every week thing, all right? Now, about the collection for God's people, do what I told the Galatians churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up so when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 through 4, set aside money on the first day of every week. That was an every week command. What did they do with the money? They sent it to Jerusalem. Okay, which one of those two are we good for? Do we need to set aside money on the first day of every week? And which one of us are going to take it to Jerusalem? Well, we don't send it to Jerusalem, do we? We kind of keep it here and use it for God's work. So you look at the example, well, but the example is they did this and then they did this. All I'm trying to say with that is when we sit down and we look at those kind of examples, we have to really think about, okay, how do they fit within the culture that we live in? Now, to be very honest, usually when this question comes up, people have two things in mind. One is the role of women in church, and the other one is music. So, if they sang, do we sing and play? Now, I'm not going to answer that this morning because, not next Sunday because that's Thanksgiving, but the Sunday after that, that is the topic. That one of the questions that you ask is, why do we have acapella music? I think it was actually phrased, why don't you have instrumental music? So, that'll be December the 5th. We'll tackle that question. Okay, so just hang on to that one. The other one is usually used about the role of women because you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and there's these questions about hair coverings. And then there's 1 Corinthians 14 and there's that let women be silent in the church. And we understand that's culture in some ways because are women always silent in the church? Well, you sing, that's not silent. You ask questions, that's not silent. So, you look at that, it's okay, how do we make that fit? How does that fit within what we're doing? And, 1 Timothy chapter 3. And so all of that's coming. All of our Sunday morning classes in January are going to be about, okay, how do we interpret those things? Now, can some of those things, are there some cultural elements to the text? Yes. There was a sweet lady I knew, and she was at the New Herman Church of Christ, and Miss Carpenter. Miss Carpenter, she was a love. Miss Carpenter had to be like at least mid-90s by the time I met her. Her and her husband both. Miss Carpenter came to church. She never came without a hat. She wore a hat every time she came in the church building. Do you know why she did that? 1 Corinthians 11. Shouldn't pray or prophesy with her hair uncovered. So she wore a hat. Did everybody in that church wear a hat? No, but Miss Carpenter did. Somebody came up to me one Sunday and said, you know, I ought to talk to her about wearing a hat. I said, I think it's lovely. Yeah. What did her conscience tell her she needed to do? Wear a hat. Should she have worn a hat on Sunday? Absolutely. Because her conscience said I should wear a hat. Now, I look out here. I'll be honest, I don't see one hat. You used to wear hats to church. I always liked you wearing hats to church, by the way. She used to wear hats to church. I don't think she did it because of 1 Corinthians 11. I just thought she did it because I like a hat. Is there a cultural element to that? Yeah. Is there a principle to that? Yes, there's a principle there as well. And so when you start looking, the question is, when is something cultural? We need to ask ourselves the question, what principle is eternal? Even though sometimes there can be some cultural elements in churches. Now, eventually you get to that third word. I don't want to talk about this one much, necessary inference, because that one gets me all messed up. I'm really like that guy on the ice then. Why don't we have a church building? That's a necessary inference thing. God said to meet, so if you're going to meet, you got to have a place to meet. If you're going to have a place to meet, then you got to have a church building, or you got to have somewhere to meet, so we came up with church buildings. Why don't we have lights? New Testament church had candles. We have electric lights, nice electric lights, by the way, but it's still electric lights. Why don't we have lights? Well, if we meet at night, it's an inference, because we don't need them now, do we? Because we could turn them out now, and you'd be a little darker, but you'd be okay, right? I mean, you won't be able to see as much. Why don't we have songbooks? We don't use them anymore. We use a projector, right? So why don't we have a projector? So if we're going to do things exactly the way the New Testament church did they have a lot of four-part harmony going on? Oh, no. But we sing in four-part harmony because we like to sing, so the command is only to sing, not how you sing. You get into a lot of things. So when you get to necessary inference, I just cross that one off my list. I just move on to the next thing, because that one just, it kind of escapes me. What happens is we can get so busy analyzing and looking and circling. We can go so busy talking about, well, why does it work this way in this case? And is this cultural or is it eternal? What's the principle? That we can miss the point of the gospel. Don't get so sidetracked that you miss what the gospel is about. The gospel, God's message, is salvation to the world through Jesus Christ. That is what we are most concerned about. Salvation to the world through Jesus Christ. You think culture will change again? I think it probably will. I think culture is probably always changing. You think we'll do things differently 50 years from now than we're doing today? How many of you, don't raise your hands, okay? Don't raise your hand. How many of you can remember when something like a cell phone was something you would see on a sci-fi show? The idea that everybody in the world would have their own phone and would carry it with them in their pocket and couldn't live without it. You know, when I was a teenager, I would have never thought that. I mean, I know I'm old, but I would have never thought that. Anybody remember party lines? Okay, you didn't have to raise your hands. I told you didn't have to do that. But at my grandmother's house, you pick up the phone, and you knew that Ethel was listening. Ethel lived down the road. And if you picked up the phone, you better be careful what you say, because Ethel's on the line. You can't hear it. You kind of hear her breathe. But you knew she was there. She was always there. Because when the phone would ring, it rang different depending on whose house it was ringing for. But it still rang at your house. You just weren't supposed to answer. So what would you do? You'd answer. Now, our house never had a party line. That was down at my grandparents' house. Anybody in here ever have one of those long phone cords so they could go into the other room and talk and people couldn't hear what they were saying? Mm-hmm. So y'all are just smiling and laughing. And now, this group down here, I mean, by the time they get our age, cell phone is going to be ancient technology. I don't know how they're going to do it. They're going to be looking at it through glasses, or I have no idea what's coming next, but it'll be ancient technology. And the world will change. How many of you growing up thought we would ever have a projector up front that you could put words on? It never crossed my mind. Sometime I went into a church and it was like, they got a projector. Isn't that cool? Right? Houston leading singing this morning, he didn't have to get up and say, please turn to number 342. 342. Let us sing. That's the way we did it, right? We don't do that anymore because culture's changed. The way we do things have changed. Will they change again? Yes. And so it's a tough question when you sit down and you start looking at the text and you start thinking, okay, but here's the thing. There are very few places in the text that we really even kind of look for a cultural bent in a lot of them. Because the majority of the text is simply about the message of God to the world about Jesus Christ. I'd like to stand up here and tell you culture will never challenge the church and will never challenge the way that we do things. But you know that's not true, and so do I. Because it will forever challenge us. And it will always be a challenge trying to understand what does God wish for us in this world. I know you're sitting there thinking, Greg, you didn't tell us in any way to tell which one's cultural and which one's not. You know why? Because, man, it's so difficult sometimes. I don't know how to do it. You look at the text, and unless there's a reason to believe that something in that text is cultural, then I just don't approach it as cultural. I approach it as an eternal command. Now, when we get into things about music, and when we get into the roles of women, which are the way that these two usually approach themselves, when we talk about that, you will find that there are principles in there. I think the principles are still very true. Because I'm looking for those principles in the way that God ministers to His world. I know this. I can tell you one thing that is greater than culture, and that is the God that I serve. He is not limited by anything. I know there will be a day that we stand in His presence, and most of the questions that we thought we had answers to, we will find out that we were so far off the right answer that that we weren't even close. And then there will be this God with immense love and tenderness and compassion who wraps His arms around us and says, you know, you are my children. And that'll be because we have faith in Jesus Christ. And all I mean by that is don't ask so many questions about the text, and don't try to dissect it so much, and don't try to tear it apart so much and ask so many deep questions that you miss the core of the text. Find faith in Jesus. And that's all I know to tell you. Find faith in Jesus. Do you think people interpret the text in different ways? They do. They do. Sometimes there's just not... I was trying to decide how to illustrate this, and I love my brother Shaw. Shaw, do we agree on every theological principle? Do we agree on every theological point? No. We agree on the major ones, don't we? We don't agree on when Revelation was written, by the way, and that's okay. He's still going to get to heaven. But he's wrong, but he's still going to get to heaven. I'm sorry, there's a little levity in there. The point of that is, when we sit down and look at the text, and we start to talk about the text, are there room within us for differences of opinions and differences of thoughts, different ways of looking at things? Absolutely. That's the beauty of God's kingdom. That is the beauty of God's kingdom. It's a struggle sometimes saying, okay, is this cultural? Is it for all time? Most of the time, I'm going to just be honest with you, I think most of them are just all eternal. I think the cultural elements are pretty slim. I hate that you got to wait till Sunday morning for me to go through the whole role of women thing, but honestly, if I were going to try to do that as a sermon, it's going to take a while, and y'all going to have to pack a lunch. Even the one about how we worship and why we choose to sing a cappella will be kind of a longer sermon. Don't miss the core of the text. Remember that salvation through Jesus Christ for our world. And you know, my God is so big that even if we mess a few things up or we get a few things wrong, my God is so big that he'll still save my soul and yours. So all I ask you this morning is, do you have faith in Jesus? If you don't have faith in Jesus, why don't you have faith in Jesus today? Why don't you confess, repent, and be baptized? Why don't you follow Jesus? Decide to follow him every step of your life today while we stand and sing.